94.4 in Nairobi, 87.9 in Mombasa, 96.0 in Nakuru. Eldoret is tuned in on 96.7, 90.9 in Nyeri, 102.5 in Kisumu, and 97.9 in Malindi. This is the Situation Room, Kenya's biggest conversation. In the studio today with you, Nduoko, Siti Muga, and our guest host for this week, Wanjiru Gikonyo. And we're starting conversations this week and looking at Kenya's debt crisis. We're looking at the money matters and asking ourselves, what's really going on here? But before we get into the thick of the conversation, Siti, today's proverb?
One tree does not make a forest.
One tree does not make a forest. I have an interesting feeling that that's going to weave into our conversations today.
Rest assured it will.
It will. Okay, so we're getting into the money talks. Wanjiru?
Right. In May of this year, the IMF approved the Kenya program for fiscal consolidation, structural adjustment. In essence, because Kenya is in a debt crisis, because our debt repayments outstrip our ability to raise revenue, because as a country we've been unable to service our debt and we're at risk of default. Kenya started negotiating with the IMF in 2019, before COVID, because the debt distress started before COVID. And then, of course, with COVID coming in, Kenya borrowed a little bit from IMF for COVID response and continued the negotiation for a program to help restructure the debt, help alleviate the issues that have caused the debt, and get us back on a sustainable debt footing. That is, when countries go to the IMF is the lender of last resort. It's like your receiver manager. You're saying, things are bad, step in, help us. So what the IMF does is they sit down with government and they lay down conditions that will help not just deal with paying the immediate loans, because they do advance some money, they deal with the issues that have aggravated. So in the case of this particular program, the priorities are, in fact, it's titled, it seeks to help, it's an emergency pandemic support to help Kenya bolster its post-COVID response program. And the priorities include reducing debt vulnerabilities, that's dealing with the debt problem. It also includes developing a strategy to manage risks associated with state-owned enterprises, supporting vulnerable groups, and investing in COVID-related sectors such as health, so that you can make that robust, and then increasing supporting transparency and the fight against corruption.
Okay.
So, it's got a number of things. Therefore, as the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, because of course we've been campaigning around debt, I have identified that this is a really important program and should be center stage of government's public statements. But actually what's happened is government has kind of signed off with the IMF and then they're going off and doing their own thing. Yet everything that comes out of the budget is colored by this document. So it's very important to understand what is in this agreement. Is it good for Kenyans? Of course, there's a lot of good stuff there. There's some bad stuff there. There's some really ugly stuff there. And what we're trying to do is just to kind of understand and educate ourselves. So we reached out to Spice FM. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And we have a number of speakers, some of whom you propose, some that we propose, that can help us understand better where we stand so that we can become more politically engaged. Because Kenyans, yes.
And even aware
and engaged. Because democracy democracy requires active, engaged citizens. There is no democracy. You can have the best constitution in the world. But if we are passive, waiting for our political leaders to legislate in our best interest, we will continue to receive the short end of the stick.
to put it politely.
We'll continue languishing.
So today specifically, we're looking at, the budget, the proposed budget 2021-2022. And the question that we're asking today is this a COVID budget? And why are we asking that question? The last almost 2 years now has shown major gaps in the health system. And was clear that because of COVID, there's so many things that had already gone wrong and, continued to go wrong. And there was already, ratifications made, Kenya being one of them, that you would make sure that health was dealt at least a considerable amount of every annual budget, within the fiscal year. It would have been assumed that now coming into this year, health would have gotten a considerable chunk because it was clear that systems had failed. So that's the conversation that we're having today. The 2021-2022 budget. Is it a COVID budget, and should it be? Joining us on the line today to open up this conversation is a good friend, James Muraguri, who is the CEO of the Institute of Public Finance. James, good morning. Hello, James. I don't know if you can hear me. Hello, James. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, there you are. I can see you now. I can hear you.
Great.
Karibu Sana. Ndu is here with you. CT is also here, and Wanjiro, as you know, is here. So we are starting off with that conversation, asking ourselves, is this a COVID budget, or are we just seeing another budget as though nothing has happened in the world and the country over the last 1.5 years? What are we looking at, and what do we hope to expect? The last time you were with us in the room, you were a bit of a frustrated man when we were looking at, what the country is going through in terms of debt. Where are you today?
Thank you, Do. Good morning, City, and good morning, Wanjiro.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm glad to be back this morning. And, the question we have is a very interesting question, whether, this is a COVID budget. No, this is not a COVID budget. This is a debt repayment budget. We are looking at, highlights. If you pick the highlights for this budget, then you realize we are spending approximately 88% of our revenue, unspent revenue from July this year to June next year, around 88% on debt repayment. So, and the amount of money we are dedicating to the Ministry of Health and COVID-related issues is negligible. We have approximately 15 billion only for COVID, of which 3.4 billion is for procurement of vaccines from July. Now, according to assessment, we need approximately 34 billion Kenya shillings to vaccinate 50% of our population. So, and with 15 billion only for COVID-related works out of 121 billion total allocation to the Ministry of Health, then we are saying we have not adequately responded to the pandemic. Of course, we know across the budget there are other provisions for COVID-related issues, like supporting the private sector through the guarantee fund, but it's not clear because then this also has to be given, in relation to the post-COVID economic recovery strategy of 2020. Of which identified, critical sectors that needs to be invested in so that we can progressively move towards taking back our economy to where it ought to have been.
Right. I think, James, that's a shocking starter because if, as you say, this is not a COVID budget, it's a debt repayment budget, we must repay the debts. We do need to show up the COVID response. So what needs to happen? Should Parliament be passing this this budget? And what changes need to be made? I think the CS had asked for some feedback, tips from the public about how to strengthen this budget. What are your proposals?
Thanks, Wajiro. By the CS asking for feedback tips, those are speech writing tips. Because at this particular point, even if you give feedback, it will not be taken in as policy because the budget is statutorily provided for with regards to when Parliament discusses and approves when National Treasury makes critical decisions. And what National Treasury did sometimes end of last year and early this year, they actually asked for feedback, proper feedback, which has been provided by stakeholders. So at this particular point, when the CS is asking for tips, like I mentioned, these are vocabularies that need to be used in the speech, and which are very important so that it can be in a language that citizens understand. Because what we'll be talking about next week is revenue-raising measures. What is already contained in the finance bill and what is in the budget estimates as provided in the PFM Act. So when you think about what needs to be done here, it's where Parliament needs to come and ask, where are we as a country? Because we had already made these commitments, and we've seen, if you look at the compliance of this budget with regards to the budget policy statement, there has been attempts and good effort by the National Treasury to meet policy resolutions by Parliament. But we also see one of the things that got breached is that the ceilings were approved in the budget policy statement, but then they get breached. And this breach arises out of what we call the consolidated fund services, of which the movement was in excess of 300 billion. That clearly, even up to now, even Parliament itself has not been able to identify, the Parliamentary Budget Office has not been able to identify exactly this consolidated fund service expenditure that has come in. But clearly it points to debt. But we know Kenya has been pursuing the debt sustainability, initiative, the DSSI, debt suspension initiative, so that we can have resources allocated, to response in the economy, and also to ensure that we are able to be able to provide resources to the critical sector. But the hardest thing also needs to happen is that this budget, the approval process, we should see Parliament calling for stronger consolidation, fiscal consolidation for us to realize. And some of these things need to be extremely difficult measures to be taken, And I think that's where we need to start, because now it's in Parliament's hands, and it's their responsibility now to approve with or with. They can choose to ignore what has been presented and approve it as it is, or they can choose to critically interrogate and approve with amendments. And I know Parliament has called for public participation on Wednesday this week for stakeholders to make comments. But we would want to see this just not being very tokenistic, where we are just calling Parliament is calling for public participation for purposes of meeting statutory threshold of public participation, but with the keen intent of taking feedback from citizens, from every stakeholder.
What guarantee is there for that, James, that whatever public participation will take place on Wednesday as concerns this budget, that they will take that sentiment and make any kind of changes that they possibly can? Do we have any kind of guarantee? Because if there is none, you can imagine that the public would say, then there is no point.
Exactly. And I think one of the response to Parliament with regards to public participation in the budget process has, increased participation apathy, in the budget process. And this is where, for example, we call the chair of the budget committee, Honorable Kanini Kega, because within this period he's been the member of the chair of the budget committees when we've had the worst kind of form of public participation, where, it's very tokenistic. We just participating so that they can tick that we had participation. And I think it's important for us to call them out when we need to call them out, because then it just beats the whole purpose of constitutional provisions of public participation.
Yeah, so James, did the CS lie to the IMF? Because one of the main pillars of the fiscal consolidation program is to support vulnerable groups and increase intervention in COVID-related sectors such as health. This is part of the promises that the government of Kenya put on the table. And indeed, every time the CS talks about debt, he talks about the COVID response. He says we have COVID, we must respond. He doesn't say we are in a debt crisis. You are saying this is a debt budget, a debt repayment budget. It's not a COVID budget. Are we being, treated to lies and PR by the CS?
So when you think about this budget and the commitments that the government made to IMF and those who we owe money to and those who we are seeking money from, the commitments do not seem to strongly reflect because we've had the current assessment by IMF, I think 2 weeks ago. But when it comes to the commitments made with regards to COVID, that does not seem to be showing up in the budget. Now this budget and COVID, everyone blame, nowadays, anything happens, you blame COVID. Even probably when you have a tire puncture, you blame COVID.
Of course, yes.
And I mean, and we have come to accept that. So what we has to think about is these commitments. How do they look? Because technically, there would be opportunities for Treasury to engage with IMF in the package that they have agreed on, so that they can draw on the resource. And most of the time, when you come to think about the resources that we are drawing, it's just about to buffer our current account deficit and to stabilize the Kenya shilling. Because every time there is a drawdown from IMF accounts to our accounts at central bank, the Kenya shilling stabilizes. So it's a critical component of our macro environment. But what commitment we've made as a country within that package is what needs to be interrogated further, because we committed to invest more on social protection, but that does not indicate our social protection is also heavily funded by donors. Just like the health sector. If you look at the health sector, we are probably talking about 20-30% of the 120 billion is donor funded. While we should be reducing this, it clearly indicates that our commitment for COVID response, it's between what we present in public and what we do in reality. They are two different things. That's what needs to be challenged.
I'm looking at the situation that we are in currently, and I feel that there's always a game of catch-up that's played, because the budget process, from what we understand, it doesn't start when a preamble to budget is being announced. It doesn't start there. Neither does it start on the steps of Parliament when the CS then is holding the briefcase. This is a process that has taken place well in advance. I mean, we're talking about months of deliberation and, looking at crunching the numbers and making sure that everything is in place. COVID, yes, took people by surprise. It did. It came out basically of the blue. But guess what? It stayed for some time. It's been here. It still is here. From all indications, it's going to be here for a while. And it has showed certain things that are not working in terms of systems in the country. But it would seem as if now we are having the conversation when it has already been cast in stone. How can we change this constant narrative of coming out and say the numbers that we see will not work? Hasn't it got to be that these deliberations and these agitations that we are seeing today need to be brought up when the process is being carried out and not when it's already been proposed? Because if we look at COVID, 1.5 years down the line, it's clear what is wrong. It's clear where funds are necessary. It's clear where the budget allocations need to be. But now the agitations come up because we've been privy to the information. Hadn't it better be that during the process of budget making is now when all these things ought to be brought up?
Absolutely. And at the Institute of Public Finance, when we released our annual shadow budget, we called, for example, for freezing of new projects. Now, in the fiscal consolidation plan by World Bank, which was done jointly by World Bank and National Treasury, if you were to be serious from last year as a country and consider no new projects or stop a third of the dormant projects, approximately 174 projects or thereabout, we would realize commitment of approximately 150 billion Kenya shillings. But you see, the unfortunate thing is what we, like I say, what we talk and what we do, that does not add up. And I think that's where probably the National Treasury needs to continuously have an engagement with citizens so that we can have, a public deliberation where we challenge, each other and ask hard questions. Because what we do is, the National Treasury will light an opportunity for engagement, a public deliberation between citizens and the National Treasury. Misses most of stakeholders. That misses. Because then there is no opportunity for deliberation, so that we can challenge and say, National Treasury have already identified approximately 174 projects that would save the country a full year of Kenya shillings 150 billion. Why then do we have to commit those resources in the budget instead of moving them for COVID response, for example?
Sure.
Tough decisions.
The other thing is, for example, yes, hard decisions. If you notice, in the county allocations, we have removed what we call conditional grants for level 5, level 4, level 5 hospitals. But in the post-COVID economic recovery strategy, those were identified as critical pillars for response to COVID. But right now, we don't have conditional grants for them. We've left it as part of equitable share from counties. And we know the challenges that counties have with regards to public finance management. It is imperative that this conversation, Senate needs to pick it up. Of course, we've seen the current conditional grants propositions approved by, currently under the Senate for discussion on how conditional grants need to move. But the conversations need to move on where are we taking those decisions, resources. The other question would be on management of our wage bill. Again, National Treasury last year identified that on average, if we were to look at travel-related expenditures and remove that from the budget in last year financial year and this financial year, on average we'll be saving another 10 billion on travel-related allowances only in the civil service. So that 10 billion in a year is what we are saying that we've allocated. We've allocated 3.4 billion on vaccines. And the people who are traveling are also a part of the population that need to be vaccinated.
Right.
You travel and you have got no money for vaccination.
James, let me ask this question. I always like the way you outline your thoughts. Very clear, very easy to understand, but also very indicting on our government by simply stating the facts. My question is this. What can we do with what we have? Because I've been listening, and every time I listen to the things that we ought to do and we don't do, if I don't stop myself, I'll go into a depression. So I have chosen to ask myself the all-important question, okay, this is what we have. What can we realistically do with it? This is what the budget is allocating. What can be done with it? Or is it just a complete waste of time and we should tell the government, just keep the budget, we don't need it, don't spend any money because it's not going to help us? What can we do with the money that has been allocated? I'm specifically in health, not the other sectors, health.
So what do we do right now? What do we do with what we have? On the line with us is James Muraguri, who is from the Institute, who is from the Institute of Public Finance and answering these questions for us this morning. So what do we do? Now we are here. This is what we have.
It's difficult because we've had plans as a country on what we need to do. With the 121 billion shillings budget for health, it's a drop, and especially in this year of pandemic. And CT, please don't get depressed. It's just prepare yourself to live. It's with what we have.
Don't worry, my brother. I'm not suicidal. It's just very daunting. What is our budget? How many trillions is our budget?
Our budget is at 3.6 trillion.
Okay, 3.6 trillion.
Of which indicates that approximately we need to borrow approximately 2 trillion.
All right. Now look we're talking health. We're talking about the economy. We're talking about injecting stimulus into the system. Everything that needs to give us a 360 attention to COVID-related issues. how much are we allocating to this? Because our biggest problem right now is COVID.
Absolutely. Indeed, our biggest problem right now is pandemic, but this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And our response is not as it should be, because we have a clear recovery strategy, and which the analysis indicates that this budget has not responded to that pandemic. In fact, it's a Parliament budget office has indicted Treasury for the way this budget was prepared. It has not taken into consideration the post-economic recovery strategy. Like I mentioned, the allocation for social protection, on average, we needed to have provided approximately 53 billion, for this response. We've barely provided a fraction of this to hunger, safety nets, social protection, approximately 12 billion, of which some part of it also comes from the donors. What's been more indicating is that our reliance on donors within this time has also gone up. While we have upped our allocation towards infrastructure and new projects that we can do without. And I remember one of the speeches that the president said is, we cannot save lives, but we can save economies. But if you don't respond adequately, you can't save lives. So we need to take measures, to save lives. And when you're saving lives is when you need to put those words in context and put resources to those words. And it means providing resources for mass vaccination and mass testing of people. Now, one of the things that is the economic recovery strategy was providing adequate support to level 2, 3, and 4 health facilities at the county level so that the laboratories at that spaces can be able to test citizens. But it doesn't appear to be anywhere in the budget. Neither does it appear to be any conditional grant going towards supporting laboratories at those levels to respond to COVID. And that's the question we're saying, that with the resources that we have, we can do much more, but there's no, I feel there's no attempt to do exactly that.
James, I think, what you're telling us, unfortunately, isn't new. It's the same story. These are new figures. The budget is bigger. But it's really about Treasury saying one thing, gaslighting Kenyans in essence, telling us what we want to hear, that it's a COVID response, we're going to cushion the vulnerable, we're going to spend on health, and then they go around and do something entirely different. And like you said, the Parliamentary Budget Office picked this up all the way from the budget policy statement. So we really need to be alive to the political economy around the budget. There are interests around the budget. And it seems this is the key problem is, where are the interests? And these projects that can't be scaled back are because they are interests that are maybe stronger than the Treasury, interests that maybe the CS has calculated and seen it's not worth taking these on, interests that even Parliament won't take on. So, one, we have political interests, and many of these are corrupt political interests, because they are interests that must be paid. That money needs to go out. But the question I ask is, Kenya has received one tranche of this IMF facility. Kenya is already beginning to breach the policy commitments it made. Do you think we have an opportunity to stop the subsequent? Or is IMF also not listening to the facts?
What I keep thinking is our IMF and these guys are literally our biggest problems. It's not in their best interest for us to be functional as an economy or a democracy. So because they have to keep their jobs and they have to please their masters. And every time you notice that the biggest problem we've had is IMF always putting our revenue projections and growth as an economy at a percentage or more than a percentage higher. So it ensures that we put a deficit. We always have our deficit.
Sure.
Our revenue deficit over the last few years has on average 7%. Now, 7% of 2 trillion or thereabouts, or 3 trillion, we are talking about 200 billion every year that is unfunded, courtesy of picking up projections from IMF and other bodies that give us money, because
James,
they will give you
I really
projections
have to
that
ask you this question. Are you telling me that there are no economies on this planet who have received funding from IMF and World Bank and haven't straightened out their act?
Their issues? That because of the funding that they have received, then they can get back on the straight and narrow, essentially, and be fine.
Or are you saying that the funding that the IMF and World Bank give third world countries is completely different from the one that they give Asiatic countries or some of these collapsing European economies?
Sometimes we want to look at practical cases of where IMF came in and helped anyone out of the life support. It has to take your personal effort as a country. If IMF walked into Argentina, left Argentina in a crisis, Mozambique in a crisis, even when they give a clear verdict that your economy looks healthy, and then they leave you dry.
No, James.
Let James continue. Speak. Say it.
James.
Let James speak.
No, okay,
Who
James.
has sent you city? Let James finish.
We
We talked about Argentina, Mozambique.
No, the list is long.
Yes.
The list is very, very long.
Whose health?
James,
The question is,
James actually
whose
knows.
health?
James knows what I'm asking, because the truth of the matter is, yes, IMF is a bank. Banks look after their interest.
Primarily.
Yes, primarily, yes.
Absolutely.
But it's also not in their interest to give you money and to have you collapse completely. It's really not in their interest.
They need to keep you on the machine, at least.
Even if you're just on life support,
Yes.
they need you on that life support. The point I'm trying to get at, James, and I'll let you continue the Argentina story because I particularly like it, is that, is it possible that our World Bank friends and IMF friends get duped by these lovely papers that countries like ourselves produce? Because if you ask us to explain these things on paper,
You believe.
we do a wonderful
Sign the
job.
check immediately.
You also just want to ask who developed those papers in the first place.
There's that little question, yes. So, but please continue, James. Now that we've determined that it is us with the help of IMF who developed those papers.
Exactly. So it's shielding interest, selfish interest. But you also realize at some point when you kick them off and take consolidation, fiscal consolidation seriously, we tend to grow. Economies tend to grow. And I'll take a practical case of Kenya in 2002 all the way to 2005, 2006. Just a little bit ignoring, and taking practical steps as an economy. Avoid crowding out private sector in the economy by borrowing, because it's cheaper to borrow, it's in terms of processes, it's cheaper to borrow internally, but then it's the safest means. And I keep mentioning, I think 2005, 2006, we borrowed zero from the economy. What the trigger effect was that banks would hawk loans, and then my side hustle would get funding from the bank, and then I would have an opportunity to pay more taxes. But as long as the bank is assured that I'm a risky customer and government is willing to buy the money that they are holding, then definitely I'll then give to the bank. That's not the best interest. That's what the IMF, they might say that you're crowding out private sector, but they also ensure that the banks continue to give the government as much money as possible. Because then, looking at the resources banks are giving to government, they are huge. And we think around, in the coming financial year, we have approximately on debt and debt repayment, domestic market is owed by government approximately 700 billion. Imagine that 700 billion was used to trigger the economy, to push it out to the private sector. The government did not borrow from the banks. It would have a ripple effect in the economy.
Okay. James,
I don't think that's the interest.
So before we even get to this issue of how it's going to affect Kenyans, James, you alluded to something earlier, that the IMF continues to allow the country to borrow funds knowing that we're on this machine that CT has talked about. You're already in a resuscitatory mode. You need help, already on your knees. And if the IMF really was involved in development of countries by giving this funding to allow you to develop, why continue giving money? Why continue giving funds to a country that is already in bad stead? Why do that?
It's neocolonialism.
Okay.
Really. The intent is, as long as I have chained you, you've got to beg me to go and get you food because you can't move.
Yeah.
And that's practically the way it happens. And we have to look at it from that perspective. That really, IMF, it's a good thing, but it's not our friends. You know, we need to understand. And their interest is to serve
Their
itself
interest.
as an institution.
Yeah.
So, and what happens most of like I mentioned, it's always they will put a figure or a number, economic growth, and say we grow by 7%. And this is always a reason so that they say that if we endorse your growth parameter, then we expect that other people would come and invest in your economy. That's why they will place that premium on your growth. But it's never always the case. The risks, for example, for Kenya are different. Like now we are talking of political uncertainty within the next 1 year or so.
Yeah.
So IMF tells you you're going to grow by 7%, 6.4%. But our politics, we know every election year, our economy shrinks.
So is it a lie? Is it a lie? Because we can use other descriptions and we can fancy and dress it up
Definitely
and say, well,
it is a lie.
is it a lie?
It's a lie.
What happened was, are they deliberately ignorant?
It's a neo-colonial lie.
James,
Absolutely.
you have made Wanjiro's day.
By using that one, by calling it what it is.
Neocolonialism is not just music to her ears; it's oil to her bones. She is a happy person. In fact, the rest of her day is going to be happy. But James, let me ask this question, okay? In terms of simply borrowing and the amounts we are borrowing, if we had the fiscal maturity and responsibility that is required, would these amounts we are borrowing actually be a bad thing?
No, it will not be a bad thing. But the question is, why are we borrowing? But you see, and also we have documented adequately that we borrow to steal.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's the most unfortunate thing. And I will take you back even all the way from including the Eurobond. If you look at the audit reports, we could not even trace where those resources are, which is completely a breach of our statutory provisions, that you only borrow money for development. But nowadays we borrow to steal and eat instead of developing ourselves.
And
then we call and say, yeah.
The IMF program does not deal with that problem. So it's a palliative.
Is it their job?
Actually, it's a palliative. It's a little pill to make things look okay for a little while, but it's not really dealing with the core driver of debt.
Whose responsibility is it to deal with the core driver of debt for a nation? The IMF can be at a point, exactly. The IMF can be at a point whereby, guess what? They're doing their business. If we want to be really honest about this, the IMF was set up to do just that. They're going to give you money. It's not their job to be moralistic or responsible about the nation's budget or their development. They give out the money, you pay it back. They give conditions. They give conditions for it, well and good. But in terms of the management of your national policies and development, I don't think that's their responsibility.
Actually, they think it isn't. But the morality of the issue is their problem, because when you have what James has described adequately happening, it's immoral. It will have consequences not just on the payment, but on the very people whose monies help pay that loan.
But then you have people who stand in the position as watchdogs, leaders in this country who see these things happening, and are the ones then who are supposed to be able to say, hold on a minute, this is what we are seeing. We have a protection policy that we must institute in this country as concerns our people and their livelihoods, even if it is coming to us ho-ha, as we say. You can deal.
When you have a problem,
because Ndu is saying this. IMF has ticked their box.
They've done their job.
They've served their master. Kenya will not collapse economically.
Yes, James.
Let me say, when you have a problem, an addiction problem, for example, the much that your family and friends can do is take you to a rehabilitation center.
Yes.
And then you can have a choice to jump out of the fence of the rehabilitation center and go
or wallow in the pit, or you can continue wallowing
agree
in the
that you have a problem.
Yes.
Or agree you have a problem and help the counselors and psychologists in the rehabilitation center
to help you
overcome the problem. And the problem we have, the addiction, the borrowing addiction that we have, is we are there, but every time the security system of the rehabilitation school goes down, we jump out, and then we are brought back by force because we have a problem. And that's what IMF does, trying to take you. They'll give you and help cushion you a little bit, but essentially it's up to you to take the hard decision. And this includes, for example, we're talking about the consolidation, looking, at our, wage bill within the civil service. And the IMF takes the easiest cut They will say, for example, the wage bill is a problem, and which nowadays I don't even sometimes think the wage bill is a problem as a as a country is a problem. But it's become one of the things we look at. We need to look, for example, what the Salaries and Remuneration Commission is doing, realigning the allowances. You have government people, officers who get paid a practicing allowance, a non-practicing allowance. So I employ you because as a lawyer, but then I have to pay you while you're not working for other guys.
Okay.
But I have the salary for you. And that's part of the reforms that consolidation reforms that have been called. And on average, that would save the country around 3 billion every year if we removed like those non-practicing allowance. We rechecked the travel allowances. We came back to the projects that we talk about because.
Talking of projects, James, let me ask a Kibaki question, if I may, please.
Yes.
If we decided that all these delightful development projects that keep sucking in all this money were brought to a halt today.
Yeah.
Not a whole.
No. I'm being punitive. All.
Yeah.
Okay, were brought to a halt today, where government is spending money, not where there are PPPs and people are spending their money, where we are spending money, and we brought them to a halt.
And where there's no returns,
Yeah.
or where there are corruption inquiries.
The returns are usually in the future, but our main problem with COVID is now, not future is all good and well. How would we benefit if we just halted them and said, okay, folks, halt.
For a while.
For a
need to tighten
while,
our
let's say
belt.
for a year. That's why I asked Kibaki, because Kibaki did the same thing.
Yes, exactly. And that's what I mentioned, for example. It's been documented by even the National Treasury itself. And, we don't even have to hold all of them. For example, we just need to cut a third of which has been documented, like 174, and not introduce new projects. We'll be saving in excess of 150 billion for 1 year alone. That would be enough to allow us to respond, for example, to the pandemic and provide cushions to the micro and small medium enterprises. You see, and then the other thing is would also allow the things we are pushing, support the private sector, keep off, and it would also mean that you don't necessarily have to borrow. Because the new borrowing we are going to take in, for example, domestically and externally, is over 300 billion. If you save 150 billion locally in those resources, you cut off. We've got to tighten our belt as a country. We've got, before IMF comes and fits that straight jacket, you have eaten, you have bloated, but then your jacket cannot fit. Somebody has to help you fit it.
Very quickly, James.
It's unfortunate.
Very quickly, literally in seconds. So how important then is talking about these things as we are doing now? How important is it? Because we say, okay, we might be stuck because nothing can be done. How important is speaking about it now?
It is. And I'm very encouraged when the media takes up these slots for citizens to engage, because this is part of public participation conversation. And these people, and they live with us here. So definitely they're listening to the conversation we are having. And listen, we must listen. And and citizens, for example, when you're having this conversation, talk to your member of parliament. You have the number, you have their Facebook account. They talk to you, they post for you pictures when they are busy,
Ask them these
having
questions.
political rallies. Ask these questions, because when they come to ask for votes, if you are dead, you are useless.
James Muraguri, thank you very much, from the Institute of Public Finance. Asante Sana for joining us in this conversation this morning. It continues, important for us to keep talking about it. We're coming around to 7 o'clock. It's Kenya's biggest conversation. The conversation continues after 7.